What happens if the person being removed from first class is actually the one who owns the entire airline? That morning, JFK Airport wasn't too crowded, but inside the quiet halls of the first-class corridor, every movement carried a sense of calculated perfection that bordered on cold. Renard Hayes walked through the priority gate, the sound of his polished black Oxfords landing softly on the thick carpet. There was no rush. Everything was in place, by the book, on time. He had booked his Allura Air first-class seat to San Diego 3 weeks ago, seat 1A, by the window, quiet and spacious, his usual choice whenever he needed 4 uninterrupted hours to review strategic reports. Dressed in a tailored charcoal 3-piece suit, no one looking at Renard would have thought he didn't belong, and perhaps that was precisely what made what followed so unbelievable. He slid his slim leather briefcase under the seat, set his iPad on the tray table, and reached for the seatbelt. But quick footsteps approaching from behind made him look up. A middle-aged woman with blonde hair tied neatly, clad in a crisp uniform with a name tag that read Candace Morley, first-class purser, stood before him, her smile little more than procedure. "Mr. Hayes, I'm terribly sorry to inform you there's been a minor seating issue. This seat, 1A, is typically reserved for one of our longest-standing legacy clients, Mr. Chester McAllister." Renard didn't respond immediately. He simply pulled a paper ticket from his jacket pocket and calmly handed it to her. Candace glanced down, her eyes skimming over the words, Diamond Royal Elite, then the seat code. 1A, First Elite, full fare, $13,200. Her expression shifted slightly, but only for a second. "Yes, clearly you've booked the seat, but Mr. McAllister has been sitting here every Friday morning for the past 6 years. We usually try to preserve consistency of experience for our legacy clients." Her voice wasn't loud, but with only a dozen or so passengers quietly sipping espresso or reading magazines, each word echoed with clarity. Renard looked her in the eye, his voice low and firm. "I expect consistency too, especially when I've paid over $13,000 for this ticket." Candace pressed her lips together, maintaining a professional tone, but the hesitation in her posture was obvious. She seemed about to offer something else when a voice called from the rear of the cabin. "Looks like there's been a little mix-up." A white man in his 60s entered the cabin with a slow, assured stride, wearing an ivory linen suit and neatly slicked-back silver hair. Chester McAllister, a name well known in high finance, smiled and placed a hand on the headrest of the seat Renard occupied. "I sit here every Friday, you know. This seat is practically mine." Renard turned slightly but didn't stand, nor did he look flustered. He simply said, calm and clear, "Practically, but not actually." Candace stood between the two men, visibly uneasy. "Mr. Hayes, we can offer you seat 3C. It's still first class, fully equipped, and Mr. McAllister would be more comfortable keeping his regular seat." Renard didn't move. "I'll stay here. If there's a problem, I suggest your supervisor handle it." Candace paused, then gave a small nod. "I'll call the flight supervisor." As she stepped away, Chester remained standing, arms crossed, his polite smile fading into a vague frown. The first-class cabin fell silent. A man behind them pretended to adjust his bag. 2 women feigned interest in their magazines, but their eyes kept drifting towards seat 1A. No one spoke, no one intervened. In the cool air and muted lighting, silence became the safest response. Renard leaned back in his seat, his gaze settling on the window where the rising sun was slowly swallowed by a drifting gray cloud. He wasn't angry. He didn't accuse, and he hadn't revealed his identity, not yet. Because he understood something deeper than any so-called operational procedure. The real script isn't written in manuals, but in tone, in glances, in the unspoken familiarity reserved for people like Chester. Today, Renard wasn't here to fly. He was here to listen, to observe how the system operated, from the inside. He just hadn't told them yet that he owns 28.6% of Allura Holdings, the airline's parent company. But they would find out. For now, he would let the show go on. Less than 10 minutes after Candace walked toward the cockpit, a man in a navy suit with a name tag that read Trevor Lang, cabin supervisor, approached Renard's seat. Behind him was Candace, holding a tablet, her face back to the default expression of practiced neutrality. Trevor gave a courteous smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Mr. Hayes, I was informed of a small issue regarding your seat." First of all, allow me to extend our apologies on behalf of Allura. Renard didn't reply, simply tilted his head slightly to signal the man could go on. Trevor lowered his voice, just enough for the two of them to hear. Due to some urgent operational adjustments involving priority guests, I'm afraid we have to ask you to move seats. Of course, your first-class benefits remain fully intact. Renard responded softly, not raising his voice. Are you saying that a familiar face can override a confirmed, paid, and pre-assigned ticket from 3 weeks ago? Trevor hesitated briefly. Candace interjected, It's simply a flexible measure to ensure premium experience for all parties. Renard looked at them for a few seconds, then nodded lightly. Then I declined the flexibility. Trevor pressed his lips together, and after a quick glance toward Candace, lowered his voice even further. If you choose not to cooperate, I'm afraid we'll have to proceed with safety protocol. The atmosphere inside the cabin began to thicken. No one spoke, but glances started to flicker. A young woman 2 rows back paused mid-turn of her magazine. The older gentleman to Renard's right adjusted his scarf, though there was nothing out of place. Renard unfastened his seatbelt and stood. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, simply bent down to retrieve his leather briefcase, folded his iPad, and quietly stepped away. As he walked past McAllister, the white man was already standing, wearing a faint smile as if everything was unfolding just as it should. Appreciate your understanding, Chester said lightly. Renard looked at him only once, not with outrage, but with intent. Not to retaliate, but to remember a link in the chain. Upon leaving first class, Renard was guided down a narrow corridor marked Authorized Personnel Only. He wasn't handcuffed, wasn't forcibly removed, but the way 2 security staff walked closely on either side made it hard to call it an invitation. A girl, maybe 6 years old, seated in the economy cabin, peeked through the seat gap to watch him. Her mother gently pulled her down and whispered something, but Renard had already caught the question. Mom, why are they taking that man away? That question, innocent as it was, became the most truthful statement uttered on that entire plane. Downstairs, the airport looked like a different world. No wine, no warm towels, no ritual greetings. Just cold corridors, sterile white blue lights, and the constant beep of badges at automatic doors. A man in a navy jacket, name tag reading Paul Redford, security clearance, waited in a small glass office. There were no leather chairs, no espresso machine, just a cold metal desk and 2 plastic chairs without armrests. Take a seat, Paul said, and Renard complied. Paul began tapping on a tablet, offering no water, no assistance, just a flat statement. Our system flagged your payment as suspicious. Renard sat still, fingers interlaced. Suspicious in what way? Paul didn't look up. Corporate card, high amount, tight confirmation window. These often get flagged as potential fraud. And you're treating me as a fraud case? Renard asked, still polite. Paul shrugged, finally looked up, but with more skepticism than respect. It's not my call. The system is objective. Sometimes appearance doesn't match data. Renard didn't smile. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a black leather portfolio. Inside were a wire transfer confirmation from Valorous Capital, ownership documentation for the account, and, most importantly, a letter signed by himself as CEO. Paul picked it up, his eyes flickering for a second. You're the CEO? The founder, the owner. The man who paid cash for the ticket your staff just deemed misaligned with image. Paul set the papers down, forced a weak smile. I'm sure you understand this is just protocol, nothing personal. Renard stood, calmly gathering his documents. His voice was low and deliberate. Nothing personal, but executed by very specific people at very specific moments, and if I didn't have these papers, how long would you have kept me here? Paul didn't answer. Renard didn't wait. He exited the room like someone walking out of a poorly run meeting, not angry, not bitter, just cold and purposeful. In the hallway, a young female employee with a headset and clipboard paused when she saw him. She said nothing, simply gave a small nod and a barely there smile. Not because she knew who he was, but perhaps because she knew what had just happened. And her silence was the most striking remark of all. Renard kept walking, silent, but in his mind, each role, each name had begun taking shape. Not for revenge, but for a map. The game had just been activated, and this time, he would hold the board. When Renard reboarded the plane through the rear entrance, there was no longer anyone accompanying him or offering polite directions. No apology was given, no explanation offered, not even a nod of acknowledgement. Only the crackling voice of the overhead speaker announcing the final boarding call, followed by the heavy clang of the mobile staircase locking into the aircraft's fuselage. The rear door lowered like the open mouth of a machine, ready to swallow him into a different class, one without champagne or hot towels, only tight rows of seats and weary fluorescent lights. He stepped into the economy cabin with his newly issued ticket in hand. 42E, middle seat, no aisle, no window. A younger flight attendant with a name tag reading Tracy Delane glanced at him mechanically and pointed toward the back of the plane. "Your seat is that way, right side." Her tone was still courteous, but carried the detached rhythm of someone who had said those words hundreds of times and stopped caring how they landed. Renard showed no reaction. He walked down the narrow aisle, passing passengers adjusting overhead bags, legs stretching into the walkway, and the sound of a crying baby up front. When he reached row 42, the space seemed to shrink. Seat 42E was wedged between a heavy-set man soaked in sweat and blasting a game on his phone, and another man dozing with both arms monopolizing the armrests. Renard bent down, slipped his briefcase under the seat, and sat without complaint. His knees nearly touched the seat in front, his shoulders pressed tightly between two strangers. Another attendant passed by and handed him a pair of budget headphones, one side already peeling. She remarked casually, "Not as fancy as up front, but decent for economy. I'm sure you're used to it." Renard looked up at her. Not with anger, not with rebuttal, just a long, silent stare, calm and unbroken, enough to make her glance away. He didn't touch the headphones. Instead, he reached into his case, pulled out a small black notebook he only used when a moment couldn't be ignored. Quietly, he wrote a few words. "Same flight, two worlds. The seat isn't an insult, it's a mirror." The clatter of the food cart began to roll down the aisle. Meal trays were distributed row by row. When it was his turn, Tracy returned, this time without sarcasm. She handed him a plastic tray with a sealed meal, a soda can, and disposable utensils. He looked down. A small sticker had been placed directly on the meal container, handwritten in red ink. "FM Special, sensitive case, meal comp." No name, no dish description, no words except a racial label and a quiet directive to handle it gently. Renard didn't reach for his phone immediately. He just stared at the label for a long time. Red ink, slanted, firm handwriting. Not pre-printed. Someone had written it by hand after he was reassigned. He opened his phone, took a photo of the label. No zoom, no annotation, just quietly preserving the evidence. Then he gently closed the meal, set the tray back on the table, and pressed the call button. Tracy returned promptly. "Yes, sir, how can I help you?" Renard held up the tray and asked softly, "Who wrote this?" She blinked, glanced down, and immediately shifted into hesitation. I'm not sure. This was pulled from the galley stock. Might have come from inventory." Renard tilted his head. "Look me in the eye and tell me. Does that look like standard labeling to you?" Tracy remained silent. After a few seconds, she looked away. "I'll check with the cabin supervisor. Excuse me." Then she left, quicker than she had arrived. The man to Renard's right leaned over slightly, trying to offer comfort. "Oh, I'm sure they didn't mean anything by it." Renard didn't look back. He didn't respond. Not because he was angry, but because he had heard that line his entire life, from people who didn't understand that "didn't mean anything" was the most elegant way to preserve a system built on intention. As the plane accelerated and the wheels lifted from the ground, Renard remained still. Outside the window, one he had no access to, the city shrank behind them. But in his mind, every detail was enlarging. The glances, the voices, the label, every action rationalized by the word protocol. And as the plane leveled off, he knew this journey wouldn't end upon landing. They could downgrade his seat, but no one could diminish the dignity he had built with every silent step. And this time, the system would answer, word for word. The plane touched down on the San Diego runway with a gentle jolt and the collective exhale of over 100 passengers. The clicks of seatbelts unfastening, the rustle of movement as phones reconnected, and a tide of eyes shifting toward the exits filled the cabin. But Renard didn't rush to stand. He remained seated between two strangers, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the tray table that had long been cleared. No one mentioned the red handwriting. No one asked how the black man who once sat in seat 1A now found himself in 42E. And perhaps it was that silence that made every face around him sink deeper into memory. He exited the aircraft through the rear door, no escort, no acknowledgement, but someone was waiting. A salt and pepper-haired man in an airline uniform, name tag reading Douglas Finch, Flight Operations Manager. He met Renard at the base of the stairs, his face void of any smile. "Mr. Hayes," he said softly, his voice lowering as though confiding a secret. "First of all, I hope the rest of your flight wasn't too inconvenient." Renard said nothing. He waited for the real message, which came immediately after. Douglas leaned in, nearly whispering, "I should let you know in advance that if you're considering filing a formal complaint, that is entirely within your rights. But please understand, when a passenger accumulates a high number of incident reports, even if not at fault, the system may automatically flag them as high risk." Renard raised his head and looked at him. "So if I speak up, I risk being denied future upgrades or not getting my preferred seat because the system finds me complicated?" Douglas maintained a neutrality so flat it bordered on apathy. "It's not personal, just how the system operates. We prioritize smoothness." "Smoothness," Renard echoed. "And what happens when that smoothness is built on the silence of people like me?" Douglas didn't respond. He nodded once and turned to walk away, leaving Renard alone in the terminal hallway, where no one was watching but nothing was left to hide. Just a few hours later, Renard stepped onto the 39th floor of Allura Holdings headquarters, the executive nerve center of the very airline that had just insulted him. No PR smiles welcomed him. He didn't need them. Every door in that building opened with his ID, encrypted at the highest access level, executive chairman of the board, owner of 28.6% of the company, and with full veto authority. In the glass-walled conference room, two people were already waiting. Naomi Fitch, legal counsel, sharp and cold as a scalpel, and Jared Lee, head of internal compliance, known for the motto, "Anything can be erased, except data." Renard didn't sit down right away. He placed his briefcase on the table, opened it, and pulled out a slim stack of documents bound with a silver clip. On top, a photo of the airline meal tray bearing the label AF-AM Special, sensitive case printed in bold red ink, still fresh as if the ink hadn't dried. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Jared adjusted his glasses. "This is..." Renard didn't look up, still scrolling on his tablet. "This is cultural evidence, written in red ink, soaked in attitude." He cast the image onto the screen at the front of the room. A confidential internal presentation titled, "Allura Airlines, Cultural Restructuring and Leadership Accountability Review." The first slide, an image of Renard being removed from seat 1A. The second, a list of the involved employees, from flight attendant Candace Morley, to cabin supervisor Trevor Lang, to security agent Paul Redford, and Douglas Finch. The final slide displayed a budget graph, detailing a $120 million restructuring plan for training, oversight, and replacement of frontline leadership. Jared straightened. "You intend to execute this entire proposal immediately?" Renard nodded. "The plan was written 2 months ago. I just needed a reason to sign it." Naomi cut in, voice glacial. "This will directly affect more than 40 mid-level managers. There will be resistance." Renard closed his tablet and looked at them squarely. "Sometimes, change doesn't begin with a quarterly report. It begins with a meal tray scribbled in bias. I didn't come here to react. I came here to rebuild." No one in the room objected. They didn't need to. Because Renard wasn't speaking as a man offended. He was speaking as a man rewriting the company's charter, line by line. And as he stepped out of the conference room, Naomi said something Jared would remember for the rest of his career. "I used to think a strong CEO was someone who knew when to speak. Turns out, even stronger is the one who stays silent long enough for the system to reveal itself." Renard didn't respond, but he knew, deep in his core, this was only the beginning. And what was coming next would be the coldest reckoning yet from a system forced to bleed itself clean. Less than 2 hours after Renard signed off on the system-wide restructuring, an urgent bulletin was pushed to the internal command network of Allura Holdings. The title was simple, but sent a chill through every recipient. Emergency Ethics Review. All personnel linked to Flight 274. The first line was prioritized and sent directly to the mobile devices of over 30 management-level employees. You are receiving this message because your name appears in an internal control report tied to a Tier 1 priority incident. Please do not power off your device. In Beverly Hills, Candace Morley was seated at her usual cafe, a latte resting beside her next week's flight roster when her phone vibrated lightly. The screen flickered, then went black. When she restarted it, a single white message appeared against a black background. Your Allura system access has been locked. Please contact the Legal Affairs Department. She frowned, thinking it was a system glitch. It wasn't until she opened her personal email that she saw the encrypted, non-forwardable notice from Allura Legal. You are under temporary suspension pending investigation. All system access has been revoked. Please prepare for your hearing. At Denver International Airport, Trevor Lang had just finished onboarding a new flight attendant class when two internal security officers stopped him. Mr. Lang, we need to collect all company-issued devices. A suspension order has just been issued. Trevor tried to stay composed, but his confusion was plain as he was asked to hand over his ID badge and internal phone on the spot. In 16 years with Allura, he had never been named in a disciplinary action without warning. In Omaha, Paul Redford was leaving the dry cleaners when a call came in from an unlisted internal line. The voice on the other end was brief. Mr. Redford, your access and pension fund have been frozen pending review. A lock order is in effect. Please do not leave the state for the next 10 days. He ended the call, pale-faced, and sat slumped in his car for nearly 15 minutes, unable to start the engine. Meanwhile, at Allura's New York headquarters, Jared Lee, the man who once signed off on the most complex compliance protocols, was now facing something brutally simple. The system he built was locking out every employee tied to Flight 274. Company-issued devices were being collected, personal files sealed, and all internal records flagged for permanent retention under anti-deletion protocol. More chilling still, no public statement was made. Only ghost-like notifications appearing silently on their mobile screens. You no longer have authorized access to the organization. All inquiries will be handled through legal counsel. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone could feel something had collapsed. Something invisible that once shielded cold stares. Decisions based on discriminatory instinct and the unspoken nods passed between those who thought they were simply keeping operations smooth. They had believed they were operating the system. They didn't realize they were the system. And now that system was turning back to grind them down, layer by layer. Across internal chat threads, employees whispered, "Delane's out of the group." Lang was escorted home. Redford's being reviewed for reports going back 4 years. The CEO pulled the trigger. Rumor says he was the guy they bumped from first. Everything began to unravel, not with an explosion, but with a steady rhythm of muted notifications. Your account has been deactivated. In a modest apartment in San Francisco's Mission Bay district, Tracy Delane, the attendant who once handed out a meal tray labeled AF-AM Special, was drying her hands after doing dishes when the doorbell rang. A package lay at her doorstep, an overnight envelope from the Office of Legal Affairs. Inside, a single sheet of paper printed in bold, icy text. Your retirement package valued at $320,000 has been revoked under Clause 9.4.4, breach of ethics in priority service conduct. She collapsed onto the kitchen floor, hands trembling, chest hollow. 29 years of service, not measured by a thank you, but by one frozen sentence. Retirement account no longer active. And in that moment, she understood. The wound she once scrawled thoughtlessly onto a meal tray had returned to inscribe itself indelibly onto the record of her life. And that was only the end of the surface. Beneath it, a deeper layer remained, where true change wouldn't begin with punishment, but with possibility. And that possibility was waiting to be placed into someone's hands. The community kitchen at Mission Harvest smelled of tomato, black pepper, and warm bread. On this Thursday afternoon, sunlight streamed diagonally through a dust-specked window above the hanging racks of cooking utensils. Tracy Delane, once a flight attendant, once the holder of a six-figure pension, once someone who believed difficult passengers were simply burdens, was scrubbing a stainless steel tray stained with burnt flour. She had been doing this every day for nearly 3 months since her dismissal. No paycheck, no insurance, no recognized employment record. Only one thing remained with her: the awareness that something needed to be made right, not for reputation, for herself. And then the kitchen door swung open, bringing with it the sound of familiar footsteps and a voice that was warm, steady, and without performance. "Excuse me, we're looking for the center director to discuss next month's operational support plan." The speaker was none other than Renard Hayes, in a plain white shirt holding a thick folder, standing among a team of executive advisors from the nonprofit he had recently helped restructure. He didn't see Tracy at first, but she saw him, and her scrubbing paused. Tracy stood upright, slowly peeled off her rubber gloves, and dried her hands with an old cloth. She didn't walk toward him immediately. Instead, she moved to the sink, set the tray down, took a deep breath, then turned and walked in his direction. No one in the room quite understood what was happening, but something in the air shifted in a way that defied explanation. Renard was mid-conversation with a coordinator when his eyes met hers. Just for a moment. He recognized her instantly, not because of the graying hair or the apron dusted with flour, but because of something that could not be hidden in the eyes of someone who once had been wrong and was no longer running from that truth. Tracy didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't have to. She simply walked up to him, stood silently for a few seconds, then said, "I used to think I was upholding a standard, that if I didn't mark the tray for someone special, I'd be penalized for being careless. But I've come to understand, I wasn't protecting any standard. I was preserving a bias I never had the courage to question." Her voice didn't tremble. She wasn't pleading. It was simply honest, and that was enough to stop Renard in his tracks. He didn't need an apology. What he needed was acknowledgement, and she had just given it to him. He nodded, slowly and softly. "I know," he said. "Thank you for saying it." No more words were exchanged. He turned back to his meeting, and Tracy returned to the kitchen, finishing the last few trays. But everyone in that room knew that something deep inside both of them had just been reset. Not through policy, not through media, but through timely decency, even if it arrived late. The following week, during an internal training session at Allura Holdings, held at the Hopewell Community Center in Oakland, a man named Douglas Finch stood in front of a group wearing a gray button-down shirt, no name tag, no laptop. On the whiteboard behind him was a handwritten line: "Unconscious bias and the comfort of the unaffected." Douglas, the same man who once warned Renard about becoming a high-risk passenger, was now speaking to young professionals about how systems invisibly reinforce prejudice and how he had once been part of it without knowing. No excuses, no deflections, just a willingness to confront it. Renard wasn't present. He didn't need to be. Because what he set out to do was never about tearing down individuals. It was about redefining leadership. A system doesn't change because its leader gets angry. It changes when that leader is willing to walk through every level of injustice and return, not to retaliate, but to rebuild. He never asked to reclaim seat 1A, but from that day on, no one dared assign first class to anyone simply because they looked like they'd always sat there. And that is the kind of power no one can buy, because it doesn't reside in a seat. It resides in how we respond when we are pulled from it. A system may run on procedures, but it is sustained by habit. And when those habits harden into prejudice, sometimes all it takes is one person, at the right moment, to stand up and force the entire machine to reckon with itself. Renard Hayes did not reclaim seat 1A through power, but through quiet resolve and patience. Because true justice doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be enacted at the right time, by someone willing to hold their integrity in a place where it no longer exists. If you believe change begins with how we face injustice, then, like this video, subscribe to the channel for more stories that speak to the heart, and leave a comment with the phrase "choose justice," because that may be the most powerful way to stand with truth.